If you're a guest, I just want to say hey to you. My name is Michael Bailey. I am one of the pastors here at Midtown. If you're joining us online, I want to say a special hey to you too. Glad you're with us wherever it is that you are right now, being able to tune in. It's my joy and privilege, and I'm excited to get to be with us as a family today, to get to open up God's word, to be more shaped and molded and made into his image, to understand his vision for life, and to understand his vision for what we are called to as parents, which is what we are digging in on for last week and this week. So basically, we are closing out our series on the family of God, like what it means for us to be, as the church, God's family. And we're using these last 2 weeks of the series to really zero in on our individual families, to talk about what it means to raise little families of God in the greater family of God. And so the way we've kind of talked about it in some respects is that we think of our homes, honestly, as little churches, that in many ways our homes are little microcosms of what God's people are actually meant to be and be about at large. So what God describes for his church at large and what he wants for his church at large, he actually wants for our nuclear families as well in small. And so our families are meant to be this space where faith and discipleship and the love of God are manifested and made known and cultivated and grown. That this is what God intends for our little family units. Now, last week we did some big picture work. We kind of zoomed out to the 30,000 foot view of like, what is the biblical vision for parenting? And so we talked some bigger picture ideas. And this week what we're gonna do is we're gonna get a little bit more into the weeds, all right? We're gonna get down on the ground level some and talk about some of the nuts and bolts of what goes into parenting and how we understand and how we plan for the job that God has given us to do. And I just wanna say here in the beginning that, to be quite honest with you, I am not going to be able to do all of this content justice. There's so much that we could say when it comes to the nuts and bolts of parenting and how we approach it and what we do and what we say and all of that. To be honest with you, we could probably teach a conference on all the nuts and bolts of parenting. In fact, historically speaking, that is exactly what our family of churches has done with our Milestones weekends that we typically do every year, where it's just a day where we dive into all of these vast nuts and bolts to the parenting endeavor. And so I just want to say, like, if there's anything that I say today that you're like, oh, that was really good, I sure wish he had said more about that, or man, I'm glad he said this, but I really wanted him to go in on this other thing that I'm having trouble with, chances are we probably have taught about whatever that is at some point over the history of our churches. And you actually can access that information. If you just go to our website, click on the resources tab, there'll be another little tab that says parenting. You can find all of our milestones and parenting content there. I would love for you, I just want to commend that to you to check out if you want to dive in a little bit deeper on some of the how-tos of parenting and raising our kids in the Lord. Specifically, we're going to be in Ephesians chapter 6 today. So if you want to go ahead and grab a Bible or open up your Bible or turn it on or whatever you do and get there, that would be great. I do want to say a couple of quick notes before we dive in, because I know that while the vast majority of the demographic that makes up our church are young families with kids, there are still a lot of us here who don't have kids, who aren't currently raising families. And so I just want to speak to you briefly for a second and just really ask you to not tune me out tonight or this morning, because we're going to talk about some very on-the-nose parenting things, and there might be a tendency in you to want to check out a little bit, but I would encourage you not to do that. For one, parenting may be in your future. Like, there is this reality that there's the possibility that you may one day raise kids. And what I would love for you is to be able to take some of the things that we talk about today and already have a good foundation built should you endeavor into parenting in the future. Secondly, even if parenting isn't going to be in your future, chances are, not even chances, you are church family with people who are parents. People that God has called you to walk alongside, to help love and shape and disciple into God's vision for human flourishing. And the reality of it is like we talked about last week, this whole endeavor of raising up the next generation in the Lord is really a whole church endeavor. It's not something that's just limited to parents, but we all have a role to play. And you specifically can be an encouragement and a support structure alongside those of us who have kids in this whole thing. And so I want you to kind of tune in into the things that we're saying today, that you might be able to be that encouragement for the parents who are in your life. So all of those disclaimers aside, let's dive in and get down to business. We're going to be in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Let's check out what it says. So we were in this text for a bit last week, and here's what Paul writes. He says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." So last week, we focused really heavily on verse 4 and said that, hey, this really is the biblical vision for parenting. That this is what Christian parenting is really all about. We summed it up in one word. We said that parenting is discipleship. That at its core, parenting is discipleship, to bring our kids up in the way of Jesus. That our job as parents is to oversee the formation of our children in the hopes that by God's grace, they become persons who one day love, trust, and follow Jesus and live out the way of God in the world around them. And the way that Ephesians 6 here describes how we do this is primarily through two things. Paul writes, instruction and discipline. That when it comes to raising our kids in the way of Jesus, instruction and discipline are two key components to this whole parenting journey. So what I want to do is we kind of get in. I want to talk about instruction and discipline for just a minute, kind of define those terms for us. So when we talk about instruction, what we're talking about is the things that we say. Instruction is the things that we say, the things that we teach, the things that we rebuke, the things that we repeat over and over and over and over and over again, such that it saturates the young minds that God has put in our home. When we talk about instruction, we're talking about answering the questions of who is God and what is he like? Answering the questions of who am I and what am I here for? What am I made for? We're answering who are we, both as a family and who are we as God's people? And what does that mean we value? And what does that mean we do? Answering questions like, how does the world work? What does human flourishing really look like? What does a thriving life in God's world actually entail? Namely, what are the right things to do and what is the right way to live? And conversely, what are the wrong things to do and what are sinful and broken ways of living and thinking and believing? These are all the things that as parents we seek to instruct and invest into our children. Now, discipline, on the other hand, deals with the things that we do. So if instruction is the things that we say, discipline are the things that we do, the actions we take to get that message across, to move it from our children's minds into their hearts and their hands. And discipline is both formative things that we do and corrective things that we do for the good of our children. So I'll give you some examples of how these things look like just in my own family's life. So for example, in my house, on almost a daily basis, we are trying to instruct our kids on how God calls us to steward the things that he has given us, which is a really wordy way of saying we are trying to teach our kids to share, okay? Like that's what we're after. And so in our house, we have this script that we just go through over and over again, that we repeat such that this instruction gets into their minds. And it's really simple. We say, hey, what are toys meant to do? Bring us together. These people that are in my life group, so they know this. They hear me say it all the time. Toys are meant to bring us together. It's just this really simple way of emphasizing to our kids, hey, everything that we have has been given to us by God for us to enjoy and for us to enjoy with others. These things that God has given us are meant to be a blessing. We are meant to be a blessing with the stuff that God has given us. But now, obviously, the question of the moment is, well, what do we do when that doesn't happen? Typically, Lauren and I will ask, well, hey, if toys are meant to bring us together, is that happening right now? Obviously, it's not. So we have to deal with that. And that's where discipline for us comes in. And we have a routine and a pattern that we typically take with discipline. Like if the toy is not serving its purpose, the first thing that happens is the toy goes away. The toy goes away since it can't fulfill what God intends for it to fulfill. And if that doesn't help us learn to steward the rest of our stuff well, then you go away for a little bit. You go to time out until you can wrap your mind and wrap your heart around how God intends for you to use the things he has given you. And if that still doesn't work, then you and daddy go away until we can get this crystal clear. It's how it goes in my house. But the point being is that this is what we do as parents. We instruct and we discipline. In fact, this is much of the day in and day out of parenting. It's what it looks like, instruction and discipline, over and over and over again. But it's not just instruction and discipline for instruction and discipline's sake, but it's instruction and discipline with a goal in mind, with a trajectory, a target we are trying to hit. And it might just be because I'm a dude who happens to enjoy hunting, but I love the image that Psalm 127 gives us for this whole idea of raising kids. So this is Psalm 127, verse 4. Check out what it says. The psalmist writes, like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. That is such a bad to the bone verse when it's talking about kids, right? Like arrows in the hands of a warrior, that children are arrows in the quiver. And what is an arrow meant to do? This is not a trick question. It's meant to be shot. It's meant to be released. And I just realized how questionable that sounds that I just said children are meant to be shot. Follow me. Follow the illustration, not necessarily the words that I say. Children are meant to be released out into God's word. They are meant to be a weapon for the kingdom. And that's what we're going for as parents, to one day, by God's grace, shoot these arrows out into the world for the glory of God and for the sake of his kingdom, for the sake of his eternal purposes. This is what we want. Now, I don't know how many of you took up wooden arrow making as your quarantine hobby. I know a lot of us got into some really weird stuff over the past year, but I don't know how many of us got into arrow making. But basically, it's a process called fletching, and it works like this. Basically, the gist of it is that for an arrow to fly straight, an arrow must be straight. The problem is that tree branches from which we make arrows don't grow perfectly straight on their own, which means they have to be straightened out. And so to straighten a wooden arrow, what you would do is you would apply heat to wherever it was bent so that the wooden fibers loosen up, and then you add gentle pressure until the bend straightens out. And in my opinion, that is an absolutely fantastic image for what Ephesians 6 is talking about here when it talks about instruction and discipline. That what parents are doing is we are applying the necessary heat and the necessary pressure to shape and instruct and discipline our kids, to bring them up so that they are ready to launch out and fly straight. That's what instruction and discipline is. So there's another church that's a bit older than us that our staff tends to learn from a lot and consult with from time to time. And they created a chart that I think really captures this vision very, very well. You guys can check it out. This is what it looks like. That this is primarily what our child development process looks like as believers, what we're aiming for as followers of Jesus, that we want to, as our children age, that this is how we are to develop them, that we want to start by setting a good foundation when they're young and gradually increase the freedom and responsibility that they have over time, such that when they are ready to be adults, when they're ready to leave our house, we send them out well. Basically, we want to lay the right foundation for them, starting with establishing authority when they're young, because learning to listen to you as their mom and dad it teaches them and prepares them to listen to God. And we want to develop them in their middle to early years to prepare them to take ownership over their fate and their life. We want to give them responsibility that shapes them. And then in the teenage years, it becomes all about responsibly facilitating their independence, preparing them for flight, so to speak. The end goal being a human being who is sharpened, a sharpened human being who loves and trusts God, where we're not concerned about being friends with them when they're 12 because they're 12, but we're concerned with growing them into mature Christians one day, one that we would gladly want to hang out with when they're 22, regardless of whether or not they're our kids. But the issue is that our typical pattern often tends to be the opposite of this. Something a bit more like this second chart here. Instead, our typical pattern for approaching parents usually tends to start with a lot of freedom early. Just letting the kids kind of do what they want, whatever, because they're just kids. Then as we start to see that start going off the rails, to clamp down, to try to limit their freedom over time. In essence, not preparing them to launch out well, but to kind of keep them strained or reined in. And we see this all the time. It's very, very popular. It's a lot of folk stories. Like, just let me share a hypothetical scenario with you, and you just see if it sounds familiar to your own experience or people that you know, all right? So just in a hypothetical scenario, just imagine there's a young child who is like most young kids, sweet and kind at times, and at other times, selfish and angry and demanding their own way. And the parents of this particular child are just very enamored with him, just love him so much, or just eaten up with how cute he is, such that his outbursts and tantrums and the little manipulative tactics that he devises to them are just kind of cute, right? Because look at him. Isn't it adorable how his devious little mind works? Like, oh, look at this. He's a strategic thinker. They don't see any of this as particularly dangerous, so they let his little defiance slide and believe that they are just raising a quote-unquote strong-willed kid. Even as he grows older and starts bolting from them in the Target parking lot, they just chase him around instead of scold him, because what else are they going to do? Kids will be kids, and kids are rambunctious, right? Yet when he gets to elementary or middle school, he starts to have trouble. And for the life of them, the parents cannot figure out why. It's not because he isn't smart. No, they know he's smart. They've seen what he can do when he puts his mind to something, but rather it seems like he just doesn't want to do the work. So what winds up happening is mom helps him with his homework every night, which looks a lot more like her getting a 7th grade education than him getting one. And she fully intends to stop doing that at some point, but honestly, habits are hard to break, and he'll eventually get it, is what she tells herself. But then he gets to his high school years, and the fruit of all of this just starts to show. So homework is consistently left undone. His room is virtually always a mess. He's in and out of trouble at school for being a disturbance. And then the time comes for him to get his license, and he's itching and raring to go. But his parents now are absolutely terrified at the thought of their son in a 2,000-pound hunk of steel driving 70 miles per hour down the highway. That notion just freaks them out. And they're like, my kid, no chance, no way. Suddenly the parents realize that even though he's 2 short years away from college, hopefully, he's nowhere near ready for all the freedoms that come with this new stage of life. He's not mature enough to handle this. So what do? They start clamping down. They start clamping down on him in a major way, trying to limit and rein in everything they can in hopes to corral his immaturity, which only exacerbates his reaction and responses to them, because he knows that he's at an age where he is more adult than he is child, and yet he is not being treated that way. He's being treated as though he were still a kid, and that everything's being taken away from him. And so what happens is World War III happens in their home. And the parents show up to church or to a counselor and they say, hey, listen, we got problems. Can you fix this? Now, I know that is a bit of an overgeneralized story, but does that sound familiar to anybody? Does that sound familiar to you? Might that even be any of your stories? I would be willing to bet so. It's very common. And while the best parenting in the world doesn't necessarily determine the outcomes of a child, what I would put out there for you today is what if, by God's grace and in God's wisdom, what if what he is telling us in Ephesians 6 at least gives us a chance to circumvent the potential of this happening for some of us? What if in his grace and his wisdom, this gives us the chance to maybe not let this story be the story for our own kids? I, for what it's worth, think that it does. And so with discipline and instruction in mind, what I want to spend the rest of our time on this morning is just helping us think well about what it looks like to fletch well-honed arrows out into the world. What it looks like for us to have that first chart be our foundation and what we're trying to build on and build towards as parents who would have the end goal of releasing our kids out into the world for the kingdom and God's glory. So let's start with stage one. And that's what and to be honest, I'm gonna spend a little bit more time on stage one than I am on the other two, just because the majority of the families in our church are in this stage. But stage one, from 0 to 6 years, we're aiming to establish authority. We wanna build the appropriate foundation by establishing authority. When our kids are young, the primary instruction we are wanting to give them is helping them and teaching them to live under and trust God's authority. We're trying to teach them that God is an authority and his authority is good, that listening to him is for our good, and life goes better when we listen and obey the things that he says. And the chief way we do that as parents is by teaching them to live under our authority. That is the primary way we do it, by teaching them to live under our authority. As Paul writes here in Ephesians 6, children, obey your parents, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother. And it's worth bringing up here that our culture has virtually no notion of intelligent or thinking persons willingly placing themselves under authority. But this is what society needs. And when we allow our children to become independent decision makers, we are actually giving them a false idea of what freedom really is, of what liberty actually is, and a mistaken notion of freedom. Like Psalm 119:45 says, I will walk in freedom, for I have devoted myself to your commandments. The point being is that freedom, real freedom, is not found in autonomy. It's found in obedience. Freedom is not found in the absence of constraints, but in submission to the right ones. Just like a fish can't thrive out of water, we don't thrive outside of what God commands. And as parents, what we have to understand is that you have been given an authority in your child's life to help them learn and understand what it looks like and means to live under God's authority. You have authority because God has given you authority. And I know that authority can be like a trigger word for a lot of us in our culture. Like we tend to just get repulsed by the idea and think that all authority is bad, but all authority is not bad. Bad authority is bad. Good authority is good. Good authority helps life work well, and parents are meant to be a good authority as God is a good authority. And that may be an important perspective shift for you as a father or a mother, just to recognize that you do not exercise rule over your own jurisdiction, but over God's. That you are God's steward or vicar, for lack of a better way of saying it, over his domain, specifically your kids, meant to help them learn to understand what it means to submit and thrive in the world he has given them. And so when they're very little, this is as simple as not touching the outlet when mom or dad tell you not to touch the outlet. It's that simple. But obviously it progresses as they get older to being respectful with their words and attitudes, to doing what mom and dad ask them to do when they are asked to do it or whatever it may be. But the point being, and what I want you to hear me say, is that the goal is not solely their changed behavior, though hopefully their behavior does change. But the goal is that as they grow, they will know that mom and dad and subsequently God are the authority, and that is for my good. It's for my good. And so in this stage, what we're wanting to do is we're wanting to establish that you and God are trustworthy authorities. And that really happens in two ways, all right? Or two things that kind of make that happen would be clear communication and consistency. If you want to be a trustworthy authority, you need clear communication and you need consistency. So first, clear communication. When I say clear communication, I mean that you clearly communicate your expectations for behavior, what obedience and respect will look like, and that you clearly communicate what the consequences will be if that behavior doesn't occur. That you clearly communicate both of those things. And here's the deal. You need to have expectations that cover what obedience and respect will look like in your home. You need to have that. I know different families who do this in different ways, but if I might make one suggestion that my family personally aims for us, it's first-time obedience. The expectation in our home is first-time obedience. Ted Tripp talks about first-time obedience like this in his book, Shepherding a Child's Heart. He says that first-time obedience is obedience without challenge, without excuse, and without delay. And my family personally adds on, and with a joyful heart too. So first time obedience is when mom and dad say it, without challenge, without excuse, without delay, and with a joyful heart. So for us, like we try as best as we possibly can to avoid counting down. We try to avoid counting down from 10 or 5 or 3 or whatever, because in our house, delayed obedience is disobedience. Delayed obedience is disobedience. We avoid negotiating with the future terrorists in my home, right? Like this is what we're aiming to do. It's like, no. When mom and dad say something, you do it. The expectation is to obey the first time with a good attitude. But here's the thing. You got to communicate that stuff clearly. Your kids have to know that that is the expectation. They have to know that this is what you desire of them, because nothing will sever your authority and trust faster than if you discipline for things that your child didn't know that you were expecting from them. Nothing will sever it faster. You're not being a trustworthy authority if you send them to timeout for using the wrong tone, but never told them what the right tone is. You're not being a trustworthy authority if you discipline them for that. You're also not being a trustworthy authority if you spank them for throwing food and you never told them that spanking was going to be the consequence for throwing food. That's unfair to them. They have to know what the behavior is expected to be and what the consequences will be for that misbehavior. You got to say these things, and you got to say them often, and you got to say them clearly. In fact, I would tell you to go ahead and get comfortable with repeating yourself if you're in this stage of parenting. Because you're going to have to say these things over and over and over and over again, such that your kids would finally get it, all right? So the first is clear communication, but the second is consistency. And by consistency, what I mean unchanging. Unchanging. Unchanging in standard and unchanging in consequence. So here's what this means. This means your expectations and discipline don't change based on what mood you're in the moment. It means they don't change based on who is or who is not in the room with you. They don't change based upon whether or not it's convenient or inconvenient for you, but your expectations for behavior and consequences remain the same, whatever the situation is. I mean, let's just be honest. Like when you are angry, it is way easier to dole out a harsher punishment than when you're not, right? It's just easier to do. And it's also a whole lot easier to let things slide when you're tired or distracted or got more important things going on in your mind. But here's the thing. If you're inconsistent, you are undercutting your trustworthiness and authority. You're teaching your kids that, sometimes mom and dad mean what they say, and sometimes they don't. And you just got to read the nonverbal cues to figure out which is which. If you only give out consequences after you raise your voice to your kids, often your kids are going to think that you're not serious until you raise your voice. Parenting is difficult, and if your consequences are inconsistent, you're making it harder than it has to be because you're cultivating a rhythm where you have to yell to get your point across and get them to listen to you. To help in this, for what it's worth, I would just recommend to have a plan for discipline. Like the easiest way to be consistent with discipline is to have a plan for it. Have a routine for it that you just go to. It's your default to not shoot from the hip when it comes to discipline, but to just know, hey, this is how we're going to discipline. These are the things we're going to say. These are going to be the consequences. This is going to be the increase in severity of consequences if the behavior continues. So we just know this is how we're going to approach it. This enables us to not lose our cool because we know the plan, and it enables our kids to know what to expect because they know the routine as well. They know what's going to be said, and they know what's coming. So nobody has to freak out, and nobody has to lose it. It just is what it is. It enables them to trust you and your authority, and for you to assert it because you are fair, rational, and collected, not flying off at the hip and not, putting out punishments that just vastly outweigh whatever the crime may have been. But hear me. What we do in this stage matters. It matters. In fact, all of the other stages that our children will go through build off of the foundation that gets laid here. What you do here sets the tone and trajectory for the rest of their lives. How they learn to relate to your authority will affect how they relate to all other authorities that they encounter in their life, whether that be their teachers or their future bosses or God himself. and I need you to hear me, that if not honoring you is an option, then not honoring those other authorities is also an option for them, one that they will take. So that's stage one. We got to lay the right foundation. We got to establish submitting to authority and living under God's good rule and reign. But stage two builds from there. Once we've established authority and taught our kids that God is for our good always, we want to develop responsibility and character. The second stage, from years 7 to 13, generally speaking, is about developing responsibility and character. So when they're in this middle time of childhood, the instruction is to basically build on the foundation that's already been laid, namely helping them understand that they have responsibility in God's world, that God has given them this life and he intends for them to use it well, to love God and to love others. And so in this phase, what we are doing is we are forming character. We're developing consideration and kindness and responsibility and concern for others. We're cultivating the internal things here. So instruction here moves from simply being about defiant behavior and rather begins to focus more on the inner person of the heart, getting beyond just what the behavior is and into the why the behavior is occurring. So for example, selfishness isn't necessarily defiant, right? Like we all know this. Selfishness isn't necessarily defiant, but it is wrong. A child who sees his mother come in the door with a load of groceries that need putting away and yet chooses to ignore her need and keep playing video games isn't defiant, but it is ungodly. It is not living in God's vision for how we are meant to relate to one another. And so in stage two, our aim is to help them see these things and lead them away from it. Now, getting to the heart and shaping character is certainly a process. This is not something that happens overnight. This is not a once and done. I've corrected this thing. I've engaged the heart this one time. And then, all right, we're set up and good to go for the rest of their lives. No. It's a process that takes a lot of time and a lot of conversation, a lot of digging deep. But a chief way that we do this, one very practical thing that we do to this end, a chief way that we accomplish this is to give them weight that challenges and humbles them. One of the ways that we form character and responsibility into our kids is to give them weight that challenges and humbles them, putting them in positions that put the pressure on them, that expose their weaknesses, that help them see their need for help or their need to grow, very specifically, their need for the gospel. And very specifically, I'll say this, in this, I mean chores, all right? Like, let me be very practical. I mean, we need to give our kids things to do. Cutting the grass, not just for the sake of cutting the grass, but for teaching them to take ownership over their lives and faith that God has given them. It is good for them to be taught how to handle the laundry, to wash the dishes, to cook dinner, all of that. And if any of you are like me in the room, you might be thinking, well, what if they don't do it right? I mean, there is a very specific way to load the dishwasher. Amen? Oh, thank y'all. I feel a little alone. Y'all know this. There's a very specific way the dishwasher is supposed to be loaded. But what if they do it wrong? What if they break a dish? What if they mess things up? Listen, let me go ahead and address that for you. They will. And it's okay. It's okay. And I know we all have our little idiosyncrasies on how we like things done, but hear me, if you're a parent in this stage, I want you to understand that your need for control is not as important as their need to be developed. You feel what I'm saying? They are going to do a worse job than you at the things you give them to do, but that's all right, because that's not the point. The point is to give them weight that develops them and humbles them while also opening the door for conversation that can engage their heart. So, for example, I know a family in this stage that makes all of their kids play a team sport when they get here. Makes all of them play a team sport in this stage. And I asked the dad once, why? Like, why do you make your kids do this? What I didn't say was, because I know your kids. And I don't think sports are their thing, you know? It was behind the scenes, but I loved his response. He said, listen, it's actually not about the sport. I'm not trying to raise athletes. Rather, I want kids who know how to work well with others towards a common goal, and sports teach that. I want kids who know how to work with others towards a common goal. I want kids who know that they aren't the best at everything and that they need the strengths of others to get where they want to go, who learn the value of rehearsing something over and over and over again until they get better at it, who know what commitment looks like and how to deal with failure. And perhaps most importantly, I want kids who know how to do something they don't want to do. Because so much of life is going to be doing things that they don't want to do. I heard this and I signed my son up for soccer the very same day. Because it's beautiful. It's pressure that our kids need to grow and develop. And look, it doesn't have to be a team sport, but the point is we want to put them in places that challenge them. Things that expose more than just the defiant areas of their heart, but the areas of their hearts that are selfish, prideful, unkind, weak, need correcting and strengthening, that will open the door for you to engage with their need for the gospel and the wisdom from God's word. That's what we're trying to do. And so first, we're establishing authority, we're laying that foundation, then we're trying to develop character and responsibility, which leads us to the last stage, which is just then we facilitate their independence. When they hit these teen years, we want to responsibly facilitate their independence such that we prepare them to be launched out, that we prepare them to be adults. Now, hear me on this. The teen years are years of monumental insecurity. They just are. Your kids aren't really a child anymore, but they're not quite an adult either. And yet they have all of this energy surging through their bodies that just wants to be released out into the world. And this makes them very uncertain about how to act or what to do or what they're supposed to be, putting that energy towards. And hear me, your aim during this phase is for your child to develop an autonomous identity as a person under God. And hopefully because of the groundwork already laid, you don't have to clamp down here. But you'll be able to channel all of those energies in productive and God-honoring ways in a space where it's safe to fail. The aim here is to help them see, hey, you have gifts and abilities given to you by God. Let's find the right way to steward all of that for God's purposes in a place where there's still a safety net if things don't go according to plan. So here, we're encouraging them to pursue relationships. And hear me on this, I'm not talking about romantic relationships. I'm talking about learning to love others, learning to love those that God has put around them, to lay their lives down for them like Jesus does for their good, starting in the home with brothers and sisters and moms and dads, but also spreading out into school and their other networks. Here, you're encouraging them to have a cause to own, something to give themselves to, something they invest their energy and creativity and leadership into. Hear me, playing video games all day in this stage is a non-option. That is a waste of the God-given ability and energy that he has given to them to steward well. They are meant to cultivate the earth. In fact, that's a part of what all of their raging hormones are actually raging for. To plant something, to grow something, to make something in this world. It's what it's all about. And so what we want to do as parents in the stage is we want to direct that. We want to channel that towards God's purpose. And so if it needs to be a job, then let it be a job. But whatever it needs to be, we want to channel it. I know of one family who insisted that their son run for student office because he always would come home complaining about all the things that the staff and the teachers just didn't know or didn't see. And so his parents just said to him, hey, listen, as someone made in God's image, you are meant to cultivate the earth. You are meant to bring growth and develop what's in front of you. So listen, instead of being a thorn in your teachers and staff's side, why don't you join them? Why don't you run for office and figure out how you guys can work together to actually make things better? That's what you're meant to do. Go get in the game. And whatever it is, whether it's that or something else, like what we're aiming for here is we want to give them the chance to stand in faith on their own 2 feet, learning to trust God and move forward. That's the plan. And as a corollary to this discipline begins to look a little bit different in this stage as well. So early on, it might still look like it has before, especially when their energies are being used for deliberate, ungodly, or destructive things. But progressively, discipline should begin to lean more in this stage to natural consequences. That's where we kind of want to invest. So for example, if they don't do their homework, don't bail them out. Don't bail them out. Let them stand up in front of that class or that janky looking solar system and get the failing grade that they earned. Teacher in the room, there it is. If they don't want to fail the class, then going to the teacher to talk about it and figure out what they can do is their job, not your job. They are the one who needs to handle this problem. At this point, you can be a mentor for what to say and how to say it or how to ask, but it is their responsibility. They made the bed and now they must lay in it. That is the lesson they need to learn in this stage. And for what it's worth, man, this is the one where parents, especially moms, tend to really struggle because none of us want to see our kids fail, right? Like none of us want to see our kids fail. But listen, sometimes failure is the best teacher. And it is better that they fail where there is still a safety net and a support structure of mom and dad than to fail when they get out on their own where life is going to be cold and cruel. We need to let them fail here, but that happens by giving them their independence in this regard, by letting the natural consequences of their actions be what they incur. And listen, at this point, you are meant to be a mentor because what your child needs is someone who's going to tell them the truth and let the heat hit them a bit. Because life isn't going to shield them from that later on. And you don't want to be his friend in high school. You want to be his friend when he's 30. He has plenty of buddies in high school. He doesn't need another one. What he needs is someone with some wisdom who has influence in his life. And that is exactly what God intends for you to be. Now, for what it's worth, I know that all of this content that we've talked about today, as well as all of the content that we brought up last week, has probably felt like, to some of us, a bit like drinking from a fire hydrant. Just very overwhelming. For what it's worth, I feel that too. Even as the one preaching it, like I get up here and I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, so this is what we're supposed to do? This is a lot. This is a whole lot. And so, listen, I know it's overwhelming, and it might even pain some of us to think about all the work we have to do, or maybe some of the work we wish we had done, whatever it may be. And what I want to do with the next just last little bit of our time as we close is I just want to give us some help on where to start and a little bit of an encouragement for the journey ahead. And so when we're thinking about where to start, let me just make it real simple for you, depending on where you're at, especially if you're in the earlier stages. Just make a plan. The best and most simple thing you can do early on is just make a plan to sit down with your spouse if you have one and ask, hey, where are our children at right now? What stage are we in? What stage do we need to be in? What instruction do we need to be giving them? What do they not understand that we need to make sure that they clearly understand? What do they not know that they need to know? What discipline do we need to be providing? Are we disciplining them at all? Do we have any standards or expectations or consequences? Are we putting any needed pressure on them to develop in ways that we see they are weak? How do we need to go about accomplishing that? If you're a parent of younger kids, I would just encourage you to go ahead and make your script. Sit down with your spouse and say, hey, listen, what are the things we are going to say when it comes to discipline? When our kids step out of line, when they're not operating in God's vision for life, what are we going to say? And what are our consequences going to be? How are we going to approach that? What's going to be our increase in severity if we need that? How are we going to do this so that we don't fly off the handle and we can establish trustworthy authority in their lives so that they know the things that mom and dad say and the things that God say are ultimately for their good? If you have older kids and you haven't done a great job at this, listen, just sit down and confess that to them. Sit down and confess that you haven't done a great job. So like we said last week, one of the big keys for biblical parenting is modeling for them what it looks like to follow Jesus. And a huge part of what it means to follow Jesus is that we come to Jesus with our failures, with our sins, and we say, Jesus, I need your grace here. I have not done what you have called me to do. Please forgive me and birth in me something new. Help me to change. Help me to repent. Let's just do that and model that for our kids. Come to them and say, hey, listen, we are sorry for not having God's vision for your life and for not parenting you towards that. Ultimately, that has not been good for you. And I need to ask you to forgive me. And I want you to know from now on, here is where we're going to go. And tell them the plan. Clearly lay it out for them so they know this is what's going to happen in our house from now on. If you're a parent of teens, ask them for their input in this. Ask them for their input. Say, hey, here's what we're thinking. This is where we want to go. I want to get your feedback on this. I want to help us learn to navigate these waters together because you are now in a place where independence is where you need to be headed. So how can we helpfully, responsibly, and righteously steward this time in your life? So start there. Start with a plan. But let me wrap up by pointing your attention back to Psalm 127 because I know how overwhelming all of this feels, and I want to free you up a little bit with some of the good news from this passage. So this is what it reads. Starting in verse 1, it says, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Unless the Lord watches over the city, the watchman stays awake in vain. It is in vain that you rise up early and go late to rest, eating the bread of anxious toil, for he gives to his beloved sleep. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. Now keep in mind, this is a psalm about parenting, but notice how it begins. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Hear me. God is ultimately the one who builds the house. All the stuff we want to see cultivated in our child's life is ultimately in his hands. He is the one who does it. He just calls us to be faithful to it. Parents, I just want you to be encouraged by that you are called to this job. You are called to bring your kids up in Jesus, but God is responsible for the outcomes. God is responsible for the outcomes. You are responsible for the inputs, but the outputs are his. You are responsible for faithfulness, but he is responsible for the fruitfulness. Your job is just to show up and do what he has called you to do. And at the same time, be encouraged that he chose you for this job. He chose you for this job. So like the psalm says, I want you to sleep easy knowing that he's got it, but I also want you to know that he picked you to parent your kids. He chose you out of all the human beings out there to be the parents for your kids. If he hadn't, they'd be someone else's kids, but they aren't. They're yours. Parenting in Christ is a hard and overwhelming endeavor. And people love to say things like, God will never give you more than you can handle. That is just patently false, okay? That is not true. What's true is God will give you whatever it takes to drive you to him. That's what he'll give you. And parenting is that. It is that. So let this job do what it's meant to do. Drive you to your knees. Drive you to the Spirit whom God has promised to give to you, to empower you to do the things he's called you to do. He picked you for this assignment, and he will see you through it. He has promised to do so.